You know, if you take a car to a mechanic, they can plug a diagnostic tool right into the dashboard and a computer just spits out an error code.
Right, it's super clean.
Exactly. It's binary. Like the
Yeah.
oxygen sensor is either working or it isn't. But, there is no check engine light for a nation of 1.4 billion people.
Yeah, unfortunately not.
Right. You can't just look at a single headline or, I don't know, a GDP growth rate and understand what's actually happening under the hood.
No, absolutely not.
To truly diagnose the health and the trajectory of India right now, you really have to look at the collision of local courts, global oil markets, semiconductor supply chains, and, well, democratic norms.
Because, none of those things exist in a vacuum.
Right.
A new railway zone directly impacts how fast an imported microchip reaches the factory, right? Which is funded by foreign capital, which relies on a predictable legal system.
Everything is connected.
Exactly. If you only look at the economy, you completely miss how the judiciary is shaping business. And if you only look at technology, you miss the geopolitical supply chains holding it all together. So to understand the momentum of a state, you really have to look at the whole board.
Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a massive stack of recent sources, reports, and data today, and we are going to synthesize them to figure out exactly what is happening in India today.
It's a lot to cover.
It is. And we're starting at the very foundation of the state, the judiciary. The Union Cabinet just approved a major structural change.
Yeah, the Supreme Court expansion.
Right, increasing the number of Supreme Court judges from 34 to 38, which includes the Chief Justice of India. And to do this, they have to amend the Supreme Court Number of Judges Act of 1956.
And the driving force here is entirely about volume. The Supreme Court of India is currently drowning in a backlog of 92,385 cases.
That's, wow, almost 100,000.
We are dangerously close to a six-figure docket. And when you realize the judge strength hasn't been increased since, 2019, adding these 4 seats isn't just administrative housekeeping.
Right.
It's a desperate measure to keep the apex court functional.
Yeah, but looking at the mechanics of this, it kind of reminds me of a clogged toll plaza,
Okay, how so?
Well, adding 4 new toll booths definitely helps the traffic flow faster. But it begs the question, what if half the cars passing through shouldn't even be on that highway in the first place?
That is the exact debate happening inside the Supreme Court right now, specifically regarding public interest litigations or PILs.
Right, the PILs.
The sources highlight this really profound moment of self-reflection from Justice BV Nagarathna. She recently pointed out that PILs were originally designed, after the emergency in the late 1970s and 80s as a tool for social justice.
Because normal people couldn't always access the courts.
Exactly. The idea was to give locus standi, which is just the legal right to bring a lawsuit to public-spirited citizens who could speak up for the voiceless.
But she noted that they have morphed into something else entirely over the years.
Oh, completely.
She actually referred to them as private publicity paisa, meaning money, and political interest litigations.
Which is quite the indictment. And the sources ground this shifting perspective in a highly contentious current event, the Sabarimala temple case.
Right. This is huge.
Yeah. The Indian Young Lawyers Association filed a PIL challenging the temple's traditional prohibition on women aged 10 to 50 entering the premises.
But the center got involved.
Right. The center, through the Solicitor General, stepped in to actively question the locus standing of those petitioners. They're essentially asking, what legal right does a third-party NGO operating completely outside the community have to interfere in a specific temple's local traditions?
Well, the pushback from the original Petitioners' Council was that PILs are fundamentally non-adversarial, right? Like, they are supposed to be collaborative efforts to find constitutional truth.
That's the theory, yeah.
But the center's counter-argument is that the PI system is being weaponized to basically bypass regular legal hurdles. They even went so far as to argue that the time has come to recalibrate or maybe even remove PIL jurisdiction entirely.
And what's really fascinating here is how the state is attempting to clear out the arteries of governance.
Right.
The judiciary wants to redefine who gets to stand before the bench to clear its dockets, and simultaneously, the executive branch is aggressively restructuring the administrative map to clear economic bottlenecks.
Which leads us right into the Ministry of Railways' latest move. They've officially announced the creation of the 18th Railway Zone.
The South Coast Railway.
Yeah, SCoR, with its headquarters in Visakhapatnam. Now, on the surface, this just fulfills a statutory promise from the 2014 Andhra Pradesh Reorganization Act. But digging into the numbers, I mean, this is not just a political concession.
Oh, no, it's an absolute economic heavyweight. This new zone integrates the Guntakal, Guntur, and Vijayawada divisions.
That's massive.
To understand the scale, this newly formed SCoR handles 286 million tons of freight.
Wow.
Yeah. That represents roughly 17% of India's total railway loading.
So almost a fifth of the country's rail freight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By consolidating this massive logistics network under one headquarters, the government is basically trying to streamline one of the busiest, most critical economic corridors on the eastern seaboard.
And, while they are drawing new administrative boundaries for the economy, the cabinet is also drawing strict new legal boundaries around national symbols.
Right, the National Honor Act.
Yeah. They've given the nod to amend the Prevention of Insults to National Honor Act of 1971, because previously this act only explicitly covered the national anthem, the national flag, and the Constitution.
But the amendment officially brings the national song, Vande Mataram, under that exact same strict legal umbrella.
Which changes things significantly.
It does. Moving forward, insulting or obstructing the singing of Vande Mataram becomes a punishable offense, carrying up to 3 years in prison, a fine, or both.
Now, looking at the text provided in our sources, there is a pretty heavy layer of political framing surrounding this amendment that we really need to unpack.
Definitely.
The material specifically highlights Prime Minister Modi accusing the Congress Party of historically truncating Vande Mataram to appease the Muslim League during British rule.
Right.
And to be clear to you, our listener, our goal here isn't to validate or debunk those historical claims or, to take a political side on this.
No, not at all.
We are just analyzing how this specific narrative and historical friction is being utilized in the present day to drive structural legislative change.
And that legislative change really sets the tone for the state. When you consolidate railway freight zones and then tighten the legal parameters of national identity, you are building a highly centralized, assertive administrative state.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, that kind of machinery requires an incredibly robust economic engine to actually fund it.
Which means we need to talk about foreign capital, because the Ministry of Commerce just issued a completely overhauled standard operating procedure, an SOP for foreign direct investment, or FDI.
This is a big deal for global markets.
Huge. They are mandating a totally paperless process with a hard 12-week maximum processing limit through a national single-window system portal.
Because the previous limit was, 10 weeks in theory. But in practice, bureaucratic red tape could delay foreign investments indefinitely.
Exactly.
So this new SOP is a massive signal to investors. It is designed to aggressively force bureaucratic efficiency.
I do have to push back on the mechanics of this, though. Like, if a foreign entity wants to invest in a sensitive sector, or if the money is coming from a country sharing a land border with India, that requires intense scrutiny from the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Ministry of External Affairs.
Right, the security checks.
Yeah. So how does a rigid ticking clock of 12 weeks not compromise national security? I mean, you can't just rush a background check on a foreign defense contractor.
It's a crucial question. And, the SOP has a rather ingenious bureaucratic hack built into it to address exactly that.
Okay, what is it?
The timeline is strictly tiered. The reviewing ministries get 2 weeks for initial scrutiny and then 4 weeks to provide detailed comments. But here is the mechanism that forces the efficiency. If the Ministry of Home Affairs or the Ministry of External Affairs does not respond within that prescribed time window,
Wait, don't tell me.
the system legally presumes that they have no comments or objections.
Oh, wow. So it shifts the burden of delay entirely onto the bureaucrat. If you sit on the file, it automatically gets approved.
Precisely. It forces the ministries to either actively identify a security threat or get out of the way. It basically ensures an application doesn't just sit on a desk gathering dust for a year.
Which provides the certainty businesses crave.
Exactly, without actually skipping any security steps.
That is a fascinating way to engineer government efficiency. But while the state is greasing the wheels for foreign money to enter, it is simultaneously throwing up massive protective shields for the domestic economy.
Right, the ECLGS.
Yeah. The cabinet just approved the 5th edition of the Emergency Credit Line Guarantee Scheme.
And we really need to look at the math on this one because it's interesting.
Yeah, go for it.
So the government outlined an 18,100 crore outlay, but they state this will generate 2.25 lakh crore in actual credit flows.
Let's break down how that multiplier effect actually works, though, because the government isn't just handing out 2.25 lakh crore.
No, the banks already have that money sitting in their holds.
Exactly. What the banks don't have is the appetite for risk, especially with MSMEs, micro, small, and medium enterprises, or highly volatile sectors like airlines, trying to survive the economic shocks coming out of West Asia.
Right.
So by putting up 18,100 crore as a sovereign guarantee, the government is essentially acting as a cosigner.
That's a good way to put it.
They absorb the risk, which unlocks the vault doors, allowing the credit to actually flow.
It's basically a massive shock absorber. And we are seeing that exact same dual strategy courting global capital while heavily subsidizing domestic foundations play out in agriculture too.
Oh, right. The sugarcane pricing.
Yeah, the cabinet hiked the fair and remunerative price, the FRP, for sugarcane by 10 to 365 per quintal. And they also approved over 5,659 crore for the mission for cotton productivity to fight declining yields.
Because you cannot run an advanced hyper-capitalist tech economy without securing the rural political economy that employs hundreds of millions of people.
You'd have a collapse otherwise, yeah.
Speaking of everyday citizens interacting with the financial system, the Reserve Bank of India has operationalized something called the UDGAM portal.
Which stands for Unclaimed Deposits Gateway to Access Information.
Right. And what does it actually do?
Well, when a bank account sits dormant for 10 years, the RBI sweeps that money into something called the Depositor Education and Awareness Fund, or DF.
Okay.
UDGAM is a centralized search engine that allows legal heirs to track down those unclaimed funds of deceased family members.
And the scale of forgotten money in India is just staggering. Right now, 30 major banks are integrated into this portal, and that accounts for about 90% of that DEF fund.
Yeah, there are already 20 lakh registered users who have run 34 lakh searches.
That's wild. It's a massive leap forward for consumer financial transparency, even though advocates are pushing for it to integrate post office deposits and provident funds to make it truly comprehensive.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, all of this financial architecture, the streamlined FDI, the leveraged credit guarantees, the consumer portals, it's all just plumbing.
How do you mean?
Well, capital is only useful if it builds something tangible. The state is organizing all this money to try to build the physical architecture of the future economy.
Right, and here's where it gets really interesting. Because the government isn't just managing money, they are aggressively pursuing technological independence.
The semiconductor plants.
Yes. The cabinet just greenlit nearly 3,936 crore to support 2 massive new semiconductor plants in Gujarat under the first phase of the India semiconductor mission.
And we need to understand what is actually being built here. You have Crystal Matrix setting up a facility in Dholera to produce micro-LED displays and GaN wafers.
GaN being gallium nitride, right.
Exactly, which is a material that handles high power and high heat much better than traditional silicon. It's totally critical for advanced electronics.
And what about the second facility?
That's Suchi Semicon in Surat, which is building an OSAT packaging facility.
OSAT?
Yeah, outsourced semiconductor assembly and test. Because printing a microchip on a wafer is really only half the battle.
Right, it's just the raw material, basically.
Yeah, that chip has to be precisely cut, tested, and packaged into those little black plastic squares we see on motherboards so they can actually connect to a device.
So building OSAT capacity means India can finish and ship the chips, not just dream about them. And while they are building domestic hardware, they are also aggressively cracking down on imported vulnerabilities. By November, the government is bringing standalone external hard drives under the compulsory registration regime.
Which is a direct response to the global AI boom, believe it or not.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, AI requires massive amounts of data, right? Which has triggered a global memory and storage crisis. And because of that shortage, India was seeing a flood of dodgy, substandard, and used hard drives being imported and dumped right into the domestic market.
Oh, I see.
So forcing them into a strict registration regime ensures baseline quality control. You want to make sure the country's data architecture isn't built on compromised hardware.
So we are securing our data storage, and we're spending billions to print our own microchips. But what about the power grid required to run a massive digital economy?
That is the elephant in the room.
It is. This brings us to what might be the biggest paradox in our deep dive today. India has hit an absolute home run in renewable energy.
It's incredible, really.
Yeah, over the last decade, renewable capacity has grown by over 210%. In the 2024-2025 financial year alone, a staggering 89% of all new energy capacity additions were green.
It is an incredible statistic, but, and there's a big but,
Yeah.
it masks a terrifying vulnerability regarding the base load.
Right.
Despite that 89% green addition, India still imports 89% of its crude oil, 47% of its natural gas, and 26% of its coal.
Which is crazy considering India's the third largest coal producer on the planet.
Yeah.
Wait, let's look at that math again. If 89% of our new power capacity is solar and wind, how are we still importing 89% of our oil? It feels entirely contradictory.
It does until you look at exactly how that energy is consumed.
Okay, explain that.
So the renewable surge is doing a great job handling the new growth in electricity demand. Keeping the lights on in new buildings, powering all those data centers we just talked about.
Right.
But it hasn't made a dent in our historical structural reliance on fossil fuels. And a massive blind spot here, according to the sources, is industrial heat.
Like manufacturing.
Yes, exactly. Industry accounts for nearly half of India's final energy consumption. And they mostly burn imported fossil fuels just to generate heat for basic manufacturing processes.
Ah. And the sources highlight that transitioning to industrial heat pumps is a critical path forward.
Which isn't just an abstract climate change goal anymore.
No, it's about brute force economic survival. Because as long as your manufacturing base relies on imported crude oil, your domestic stability is entirely at the mercy of global geopolitics.
Which brings us to the harshest reality of current affairs. That reliance on imported fuel links the Indian economy directly to the volatile crisis in West Asia.
Yeah, we have to talk about the escalating conflict between Iran and Israel and the subsequent threats to the Strait of Hormuz, which caused an immediate shockwave in India.
The data there is just brutal. In March 2026, India's crude oil imports plummeted by 17% compared to the previous year, simply because the shipping lanes were compromised.
Wow.
And the cost of the Indian basket of crude skyrocketed from about $72 a barrel to over $130 a barrel.
Which perfectly illustrates why the government had to step in with that 18,100 crore ECLGS credit scheme we unpacked earlier.
Right, because when the price of oil spikes by $40 a barrel, transportation costs explode, inflation surges, and small businesses face immediate bankruptcy.
It also spirals from an economic crisis into a physical security issue.
Yeah, that's true.
The sources note that Prime Minister Modi issued a strong condemnation after drone attacks hit an oil hub in the UAE, which actually injured 3 Indian nationals working there.
Which is a tragic reality of global energy supply lines.
Yeah, and he emphasized the absolute necessity of unimpeded commerce through the Strait of Hormuz.
This really raises an important question about how we define energy security in the 21st century.
Because it is no longer just about shopping for the cheapest barrel of fuel on the global market.
No, true security now requires a massive expansion of strategic petroleum reserves, securing maritime supply chains with naval power, and, like we said, aggressively transitioning industries away from oil intensity so you aren't held hostage by a drone strike 1,000 miles away.
It is an incredibly volatile global landscape. But, the scrutiny a nation faces isn't just external, it's internal.
Right.
The final source in our stack today turns the diagnostic lens back onto India's democratic institutions. The Varieties of Democracy, or V-Dem Institute, released their 2026 report, and, well, it classifies India as an electoral autocracy.
Yeah. The V-Dem methodology measures hundreds of different indicators of democratic health, and their latest report places India in the lower half globally.
Specifically citing a measurable decline in free expression, the independence of the media, and the operational space for civil society organizations.
They actually classify the country among the worst autocratizers.
Now, once again, looking at the text here, it's really vital to clarify our framing to you listening.
Always.
This segment is an analysis of the V-Dem report and the specific arguments presented in the accompanying source article. We are solely conveying the perspectives and metrics outlined in the provided text just to understand how international observers and domestic critics are analyzing India's governance.
And the source article provides a very specific contrast to illustrate its point.
Okay, what is it?
It notes that while the Indian Constitution robustly guarantees fundamental rights, specifically Articles 14 for equality, 19 for free speech, and 21 for life and liberty, the reality of how the justice system operates can be starkly different.
Right. The author contrasts the treatment of under trials,
which are individuals locked in prison awaiting trial, meaning they haven't been convicted of anything yet.
Exactly. Under trials like academic scholars Umar Khalid and Sharjeel Imam. They have been in jail for roughly 5 years fighting complex legal battles just to secure bail.
And the article contrasts their prolonged incarceration against the treatment of high-profile, convicted godmen accused of incredibly serious crimes.
Who seemingly navigate the system with ease, repeatedly securing parole and furlough.
Yeah. The core argument in the source is that this asymmetry, where individuals raising voices for democratic rights face a labyrinthine, punitive process just for bail, while convicted figures receive administrative leniency points to a disturbing dismantling of the norms that support pluralism and accountability.
And I think that brings our entire analysis full circle.
It really does, because a state can build world-class outsourced semiconductor assembly plants.
Right.
It can engineer brilliant 12-week bureaucratic timelines for foreign investment, and it can consolidate massive railway zones. But ultimately, domestic stability and international credibility are heavily tethered to how a nation's core constitutional guarantees are applied to its citizens in practice.
So what does this all mean for us? We started today talking about diagnosing a nation of 1.4 billion people, and we've looked at the diagnostic scams across entirely different systems today.
We really have covered a lot of ground.
Yeah. We've seen a Supreme Court buried under 92,000 cases, actively questioning who gets to speak for the public interest. We've seen the creation of an economic fortress shielding domestic businesses with massive credit guarantees while demanding rapid-fire approvals for foreign capital.
And we've seen a desperate race to build technological independence in micro-LEDs, offset by a terrifying reliance on imported fossil fuels just to keep the grid running.
Exactly. And finally, we've seen how geopolitical shocks in the Strait of Hormuz or critical democratic indices from international institutes can ripple through every single one of those systems.
Because they are completely interconnected.
Completely.
The economic viability of the new South Coast Railway Zone depends on fuel from West Asia, which dictates the inflation rate, which impacts the foreign direct investment pouring into those semiconductor plants, which requires the stability of a functional, trusted legal system.
It is a breathtakingly complex machine. And, well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive today. We've seen how interconnected energy security, technological independence, and democratic institutions truly are.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
It is. So, as you look at the news tomorrow, ask yourself which of these pillars is actually the most vulnerable for a developing nation in the 21st century, and can any one of them truly stand if the others begin to fracture? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll catch you next time.